presentation was fascinating, and especially I think you were talking about carbon dioxide actually being beneficial. All the UN people are saying it's pollution and it's going to kill us. So I was wondering if you could expand a little bit on some of the benefits of carbon dioxide and maybe why it's not pollution.
I'd be very happy to, but let me start by saying that you say the UN is saying it's pollution. That's true. Many of the people advising the UN are saying that, and they're not scientists. They're activists or policymakers or whatever. If you talk to most scientists, they will acknowledge that carbon dioxide is not a pollutant. Indeed, it's grotesque to call it a pollutant. It's an abuse of logic, it's an abuse of language, and it's an abuse of science. Now, why do I say that? Because if it weren't for carbon dioxide, there would be no plants, because when they photosynthesize, plants are little carbon dioxide factories. They have to have it, they take it in out of the atmosphere, and they create plants. What do we and most other, or many other mammals eat? We eat plants. And if there were no plants, there's no bottom to the food chain. And that's not just true on land, that's true in the ocean, where the phytoplankton, little floating microscopic unicellular plants, are the base of the oceanic food chain. So carbon dioxide is literally the staff of life. As you increase the amount in the atmosphere, you increase the rate of vegetal production on the planet. Now, obviously, there are limits. If you were to put in 10 million parts per million carbon dioxide, then you have a big problem of asphyxiating air-breathing animals like us. But at the levels we're talking about, the numbers we're talking about, the optimal growth of plants is somewhere between 1 and 2,000 parts per million in the atmosphere. Before the Industrial Revolution, there was 280 parts per million. So that's a quarter, or less than a quarter, of what most plants are most happy having. And they're little carbon dioxide factories. So you put more carbon dioxide in, you'll get more productivity out. Now, I stress, individual plants have their individual preferences, and some like higher, some like a little lower, but nearly all plants like higher than 280. So very sensibly, we had a policy strategy set by governments in the early 20th century of emitting as much carbon dioxide as we can so we can stimulate the growth of plants. And we've now got not 280, but 400 parts per million. And the plants love it. And you saw the slide I showed you, which is there's been more than a 10% greening of the planet in the last 20 years or so. And that greening's been concentrated along the the sides, edges of arid zones like the Sahara Desert. That's a huge environmental benefit.
Okay, I hear a lot about 350 parts per million. There's even an organization called 350 parts per million. Where does this number come from, and how, is it significant? Where did they get this number from, and what does it mean to be over 350 parts per million?
You have to ask them, but yes, it's a number plucked out of the air. It's scientifically meaningless.
Okay. And I asked you earlier about the media and what it says about them, that they're not here. What are your thoughts on the whole Paris summit? I mean, how can it be that it's such a fascinating event where you have experts and scientists discussing a different point of view, that you don't have the press here to inform their readership? But what are your thoughts on that more broadly?
Well, you have to ask the press that, but I've just finished an opinion piece that's gone off where I've commented that as a visitor from overseas to Paris at this time, I find that there are two alternative realities. There's the reality out there in the Champs-Élysées, where French shoppers are going about their Christmas business because of the horrible terrorist events. You might say there's a slight air of nervousness, but it's no more manifest than by a glance at the armed police that are mingling with the crowd. And perhaps security is a bit higher than it normally would be on the stores, but really it's the real world going about its business. Then out at Le Bourget at the airport, we have a reputed 40,000 representatives and delegates at the COP21 meeting, and they are completely insulated from this real world. They're down a rabbit hole in Alice in Wonderland, and they're living in a world that is ring-fenced by the very people you asked me about, the mainstream media. The mainstream media over the 2 weeks before the conference and running up during the conference have been running day in, day out, untruthful scare stories to do with sea level rise, to do with more storms, to do with more droughts, more floods, and all the rest of it. And you've heard the evidence today, and it's in these big volumes over the back here from the non-governmental panel, International Panel on Climate Change. Those are just lies. It's the only word you can use. So this is a really big issue, and I'd be delighted if you'd explore it. Why has the mainstream media decided they want to maintain the Alice in Wonderland world out at Le Bourget within this perimeter fence through which will penetrate no independent scientific discussion whatsoever?
Okay, and so I guess the whole premise of why this conference is going on is that we have a climate crisis. What, if anything, should be done about the climate?
There is no climate crisis. There is climate hazard. And on the shorter wavelength, that's weather hazard. That's things like big storms, hurricanes, tornadoes, and floods and droughts and all that. Now, those are things that humanity's lived with ever since we've been around. And the way we deal with them in civilized societies is we have civil defense organizations that prepare for, they get ready for, and then when one of these events happens, mitigates the effects by helping people and mopping up after the event's passed. But we don't have a civil defense organisation that is committed to stopping volcanic eruptions. We do not have a civil defense organisation that's committed to stopping earthquakes. And it is every bit as stupid for politicians, up to and including the United Nations, to think they can stop climate change. The appropriate response to climate hazard, be it of natural origin, which most hazard is, or even with the possibility of an additional human component on top, which nobody can yet show or measure, but even allowing for that possibility, the appropriate cost-effective way of dealing with it is by preparing for and adapting to, as they happen, all major climate events.
So I know that there are lots of scientists who are speaking out, but there's also lots of scientists who are either remaining quiet or who are going along with these things that the IPCC is saying, which basically, according to the presentation today, sounds rather unscientific. What is motivating such a large number of scientists to either go along with this or not speak out about it more forcefully?
Well, you had an example of that this morning with the disruption from the back of the room, which wasn't by scientists, but it's by people that talk to and are encouraged by activist scientists. It's a very complex question. Again, the answer you should really ask them. From my perspective, it's very clear that the financial advantage of working in climate science research, or rather global warming research, which is what it is financially beneficial if you're a research scientist. There is little Christmas trees all over the world put up by governments, and they're adorned with little baubles, $1 million each, and they say, global warming research, apply here. Now along comes Willie Soon, who you've heard from this morning, and he's actually working on solar. He's a distinguished solar astrophysicist, but he's not working on it from the point of view of global warming. So if he applies for a grant and doesn't relate it to climate change, he won't get a grant. So there's a huge positive incentive for active scientists to work on this problem from a partial point of view.
And how do we deal with this kind of problem? I mean, do we need to get rid of these incentives? I mean, what's the solution to these corrupting influences on science?
Yeah, that's a big question. Yes, governments have to be much more sensible in the way they go about this, but as we've heard several speakers allude to, governments are not very good at dealing with issues in any other way but political ways. And it works like this. Starting in the 1980s, the international activist green movement adopted this as a big issue, and they started running public opinion campaigns, demonstrations, producing brochures, running conferences. Critically, they penetrated the schools, so young children from 1980s onwards have been indoctrinated with global warming dogma. And all of this builds up to establishing a strong public opinion that there is a crisis. You used the word yourself earlier. There's no crisis. Nonsense. But in the public perception, there was a few years ago. I think now the public opinion swung a long way the other way. But it was established there was a crisis by about the turn of the century. So what do governments do in democratic countries when their voters are saying to them, you've got to do something about climate? Well, they do something about climate. I mean, governments don't actually use rational, cost-effective measures at that point. They're much more concerned with how do we translate this into votes in the ballot box. That may sound awfully cynical, but it is actually the reality. So starting from green intimidation and bullying, you move to getting public opinion. That then moves to incredible pressure on politicians to deliver policy on this area, and that's where we're at. And the level of bullying and aggression from activist Greens has now reached quite unacceptable levels, as you saw this morning. But it bears on the biggest corporations. Corporations as big as ExxonMobil have keeled over in the face of this pressure, and they won't have anything to do with public statements on climate change. They can get out of it.
Okay, one more question. Suppose the United Nations and all these governments adopt the most ambitious, as they call it, possible global warming treaty. What is that going to do to the climate, first of all, if anything, and what is that going to do to human civilization?
It's going to do nothing for the climate, and it will impoverish the human population of the planet. And the sad thing about it is that it is a policy which could have been designed to exert the greatest hurt on the people who are least able to defend themselves, because there's an opportunity cost here, and the money that is spent, I would say completely wasted, on these stop global warming measures could instead have been spent providing the billion people on the planet who don't have sanitation, clean drinking water, elementary education and elementary health care. The UN themselves have estimated, and I think it's 60-something billion, 65 billion, say, dollars a year, would largely fix those problems. Well, we're squandering at the moment $365 billion a year, $1 billion a day on this global warming, alternative energy stuff. So we could fix poverty in the world tomorrow if we reassessed our priorities.